Hello, Mystics, and welcome to our episode on Samhain. Today I'm going to be working out of The Pagan Mysteries of Halloween by Jean Markel and Llewellyn's Sabbat Essentials. Samhain is part of the Wheel of the Year popularized by modern Wicca. As we dive into this lesson, know that from this point forward, when I refer to pagans, I am specifically referring to the Celtic tradition that was found in Ireland as well as Scotland. So the first thing we need to know is how the Celtic people understood the year. They did not use the Gregorian calendar that we have today. They actually mapped out the year quite differently. It's also important to know that there are only two seasons in the Celtic tradition. There are the darker months, and then there are the luminous months. Within this calendar, there are four main holidays, starting with the darker months. Most of the Celtic calendar had major holidays on the 1st because they were the dates that were closest to the full moon, and the ancient Druids worked with the moon cycles. It's also important to understand that Celtic people believed that the cosmos and all living things were interconnected. There was no difference between ordinary life and magical life. It was all one. According to Markel, the ancient Celts worshipped a god completely unknowable. He was all-powerful, all-knowing, and completely incomprehensible to us humans. It is also really important to understand that in the ancient world, there is absolutely no difference between what is sacred and what is profane. They were interconnected. And on Samhain, what is sacred is profane, and what is profane is sacred. It was an inverse. I understand that's a very hard concept to understand in our modern world, but bear with me. But due to the intermingling of cultures, particularly from the Romans and the Greeks coming to Ireland and Scotland in the early millennia, the Druid practices were Christianized. But before all of that, Samhain was a holiday of mystical, political, and legislative importance. In ancient times, you would actually be punished if you did not participate in Samhain, if you did not recognize or pay reverence to this festival. Some legends say that those who did not were punished by God and driven mad. Samhain starts on the eve of October 31st and lasts 3 days. Some other authors even say it should be 3 days before and 3 days after. You may recognize the importance of the number 3. We see this number in Christianity, for example, where in 3 days Jesus rose from the dead. As we get more into this theme, you will notice that death and resurrection are a large part of Samhain and the celebration of Halloween. Understanding Samhain as a political assembly. During these 3 days, it was an assembly where kings and dukes would all get together and do their legislative business. This was also a time of renewal of the king's powers, which was really important, and we'll be talking about that later during the ritual part of this lesson. For right now, understand that judicial and legislative are different parts of the ancient life. Legislative means the passing of laws, the renewal or creation of economic contracts, and the redistribution of communal properties. The judicial part of this assembly is the resolution of internal conflict, whether it be landowners, farmers, or even family feuds. These are the originations of what we now call annals, or in modern times, you may call the minutes of a meeting. During this festival, time is suspended for 3 days. It's like the world stops. Everyone is only focused on the celebration. There was extensive feasting and excessive drinking. There was music, song, dance, and rituals to initiate contact with the other world. In the ancient Celtic understanding, dancing and drinking was a way to raise energy. There's actually a really good section of Pagan Mysteries of Halloween that describes the raising of energy as an orgy. I'm actually going to read it to you. Quote from Jean Markel: "Orgies were times when traditional values, if not scorned, were at least inverted. What was forbidden became permissible, and what was permitted became forbidden. It's important to understand that Samhain, in many ways, is like Saturnalia in Rome or the Carnival in Venice, end quote. So yes, Samhain may have included some sexual appetites, but actually, most of the time we're talking about an actual raising of energy. In Celtic culture, this heavy drinking was known as something called unhooking. This is what happens when you are inebriated. Your inebriated mind unhooks your spirit from your body, with this belief that your soul is able to comprehend and pass through the other world easier. So now let's get into those rituals. And just a warning, these do include animal sacrifices. And that's the first part of it. There were 3 sacrificial rituals that would take place during Samhain. The first animal is the stag. Stags were hunted during the Paleolithic Ice Age in order to sustain and feed tribes, and they were considered to be a sacred animal. The slaughtering of the stag to God was considered to be a renewal of life. The second ritual, which still does happen today in some parts of the world, is the sacrificial bull. The bull, in essence, was a part of the ancients' life force. This animal was chosen at a time where farmers had cows, and the bull was able to help create babies so the farmer could continue to create their dairy products to create a sustainable life. And lastly, and probably the most surprising, is the pig. The pig is the most interesting because it's often disliked or considered dirty or evil in the Hebrew and Abrahamic religions. But in Irish lore, the pig is sacred because it is an animal of the other world as well as being a sustainable resource. I really wish Jean Markle had gotten into this more, but he doesn't really explain any other reason why pigs are sacred to the ancient Celts. The next ritual included sacred fire. Ritual fire plays a huge role in Samhain because the light of the past year is being symbolically extinguished. Every year on the first frost after the full moon in October, families allowed their hearth fires to burn out. At this time, they brought back the herd of animals from grazing and completed their harvest. So in this ritual, there's a large bonfire which was left to die out, symbolically plunging the world into darkness. After the fires died, the community would gather with the Druid priests and observe the relighting of the community's sacred fire using friction. The priests induced friction with a wheel and spindle. The wheel, as a representation of the sun, turned from east to west and would light sparks. At this time, the community and the priests would make prayers and offerings or sacrifices related to their needs. The Romkrosh was brought out, which was an emblem of the sun, but scholars are uncertain whether it represented a pagan god or symbolized an aspect of nature embodied in a stone pillar. Regardless, at the end, every person returned home with a branch lit from the sacred fire, which they would use to relight their own hearth and then light bonfires or set torches at the edge of their fields as protection from the Fae and later witchcraft. The next and most important ritual of Samhain is the death and rebirth of the king. This was a test to the king's worthiness to rule. Markle explains that there's an often wear and tear of power. How well is the king performing? How is he helping society? Even if the king isn't responsible for disasters such as famine, climate conditions, or even civil war, he took full responsibility for it because he was basically the manager of society at that time. The king would fall into a cauldron and be suffocated. Cauldrons are a sign of healing, death, and rebirth, and connected to the other world. The tragic death of the king was an alchemical transformation of energy that happens so the king can be reborn as a better leader and as a better human being. I believe that this was a dramatic play. I do not believe that the king was actually killed, but I'm not 100% sure. Remember, there are 3 days to the festival. November 1st is the light aspect of Samhain with ritual fires. In the Celtic worldview, during Samhain, the veil between worlds is very thin. It is also known as a time of passage for souls, and the ability for the dead to intermingle with the living. Some denominations of Christians say on November 1st that souls in purgatory could be moved from purgatory into heaven. Their souls would be cleansed. So now the question is, how did we get from all of this to Halloween, where we're giving out candy to children and celebrating by dressing up as our favorite superheroes? Halloween, as you and I know it, is only a few hundred years old. Trick-or-treating is a modern incarnation of old Irish, Manx, and Scottish practices that sometimes occurred over multiple nights leading up to Samhain. Dressing up began with the Druids and ancient Celtic villagers who would dress up as animals or as frightening creatures such as ghosts, wandering the edge of their settlements in groups, involved in a moving ritual theater known as mumming. Later, in Ireland, the poor went door to door mumming or souling. The poor offered songs and prayers for the dead. As payment, the owners of the homes gave them soul cakes, cookies with a cross drawn on top, representing each soul detained in purgatory. Some people saw the soulers carrying turnip lamps as they went about their rounds, enacting the role of the dead souls seeking their food offerings. In Scotland, during the 18th century, children would dress up to personify spirits and hide their faces behind masks and parade around the town. They would make their costumes out of straw, mostly representing animals as a way to prevent kidnapping from the Fae and then later by witches. In Somerset, children went door to door on October 30th called Punky Night. The colloquial name Punky referred to their turnip or beet lanterns. On this holiday, children begged their neighbors for money to pay for fireworks used on the next night called Mischief Night. The locals considered it unlucky to refuse. Llewellyn writes, "When the Irish came to the New World, they brought their costume traditions along. In colonial America, they had masquerade parades that over time caught on among their neighbors." Halloween is also a tradition of pranks, hence Mischief Night, even obnoxious ones. All of this has its foundation in pagan tradition, blaming the fairies. While nothing on the record specifically speaks to logic of this, it seems to be a part of the holiday, involved acting out a series of pranks, either a way as fooling the fairies or just because some people might blame the fae. Another iconic symbol of Halloween is the jack-o'-lantern, which comes from Welsh culture. We've talked about these beet and turnip lamps before. Those who went out at night during Samhain would carry carved pumpkins on strings with a glowing piece of coal inside. Some said it was to scare off the fae. These are the beginnings of jack-o'-lanterns, and they come about even more so after a Christian legend called Old Jack, a man so evil that both heaven and hell refused him. With nowhere to go but purgatory, Jack had to roam the roads on Halloween night with nothing but a turnip lamp to light his way. When Halloween observances came to America, pumpkins were more common than turnips, so Irish settlers used those for their lanterns instead. The jack-o'-lanterns would be left on the edge of walks or fields in order to keep the witches away, but also to light a path for the ancestors wandering across the veil. This is a callback to those fire rituals guiding the dead through the dark and into the light. So how did Halloween and Samhain become so evil? Simply a misunderstanding and a fear of the dark. Samhain is about the renewal of power. It's about death and rebirth, to become a better person and to have an honest, loving respect for those who have passed on. Join me in our Zoom class to talk about spells, recipes, and prayers that you can do to celebrate Samhain on your own. And until next time, mystics, stay magical.